The roadside was quiet in a way that only highways get quiet late at night. Not silent, but hollow, like the sound has been drained out of the air. And Richard Lewis stood beside his car under a dim streetlight that flickered every few seconds, counting his breaths without realizing he was doing it. Because when you wait for someone you trust, you do not feel fear. You feel certainty. And not certainty is exactly what killed him. Later, though, nobody would say that out loud at first because it sounds cruel to blame trust. And Richard Lewis was not a careless man. He was a 48-year-old warehouse supervisor, known among coworkers as boring, dependable, predictable. The kind of man who paid bills early, kept receipts folded in his wallet, and still called his son every night to ask if he reached home safely. And that night began no differently, except for one thing. It began at the roadside because his son had called him asking for help, and Richard had come without hesitation, without questions, without suspicion. Because when Daniel Lewis called and said, "Dad, I'm stuck near the service road. My bike just shut down," Richard did not ask where exactly or why or how long he had been there. He simply grabbed his keys, locked his apartment door, and drove out, because that is what parents do when the voice on the phone belongs to their child. And the roadside service road he drove to was known locally as a dead strip, a place where traffic noise never fully fades, but people rarely stop, because there are no shops, no houses, no cameras, just broken pavement and wild grass and one working streetlight that buzzes like an insect. And Richard parked exactly where Daniel told him to, and when Daniel stepped into the car, Richard noticed nothing alarming. No injuries, no panic, no smell of alcohol. Daniel looked tired, annoyed, embarrassed even, joking, saying, "This stupid bike hates me." And Richard smiled because he had heard that tone since Daniel was 10 years old and came home late from school with excuses and scraped knees. And that smile would later be described by a police officer as relaxed, unaware, unguarded. And that mattered because it showed there was no argument, no tension, no reason for what happened next, at least not one that made sense at the time. They drove less than a minute before Daniel asked him to stop again, saying his stomach felt wrong, maybe anxiety, maybe nausea. And Richard pulled over near the edge of the road without thinking, because he trusted his son the way people trust gravity, the way people trust morning to come after night. And Daniel stepped out, bending slightly, hands on knees, breathing fast, and Richard watched him from the driver's seat, headlights illuminating dust, weeds, and a rusted signboard. And that was the last normal moment, because within seconds Daniel made a sound that witnesses later described as a sharp inhale, like air being pulled through a punctured tire. And Richard opened the door thinking his son was about to vomit. And then Daniel collapsed sideways onto the gravel, and Richard screamed his name, dropped to his knees, and saw blood spreading under Daniel's jacket, dark and fast and unnatural, and he pressed his hands against his son's side, shouting for help, shouting for someone, anyone passing on the road. And that scream was what made a truck driver slow down, call emergency services, and describe a man kneeling by the roadside covered in blood, crying like a child. And when police arrived, they found no weapon, no attacker, no sign of struggle, no one running away, just a father and a son and a single deep wound under the left rib cage, clean, precise, fatal. And doctors later said death would have occurred in under 2 minutes due to internal bleeding and shock. And that detail is important because it means whatever happened quickly, without hesitation, without chaos. And that did not match the idea of a random roadside attack, because random attacks leave mess. They leave defensive injuries, torn clothing, scattered items. But Daniel's clothes were intact, his wallet untouched, his phone still in his pocket, and the only footprints near the body belonged to Daniel himself and Richard Lewis. And when questioned, Richard could not explain anything beyond the truth as he knew it. He said, "My son asked me to stop. He stepped out and then he fell." And officers initially believed him because grief like his does not look rehearsed, and because there was no motive, no history of violence, no financial dispute, no insurance issue, and because trusting your own son is not considered suspicious behavior in any society. And that was the mistake, because the case should have ended there, but it didn't, because something about the timing bothered the responding officer, a woman named Laura Bennett, who noticed that Daniel's body was still warm when they arrived, meaning the window between collapse and emergency call was extremely short. And when the call logs were pulled, they showed Daniel had called his father at 10:44 p.m., and emergency services were contacted at 10:44 p.m., leaving less than 2 minutes between pickup and death. And in those 2 minutes, there was no time for an unknown attacker to appear, strike accurately, and disappear disappear without leaving a trace, and that timeline quietly shifted the case from tragedy to question, and that question was not asked loudly, not at first, but it echoed in every report, every re-examination, every silent glance between investigators. Why did Mr. Lewis trust his son that night so completely that he never once imagined the danger was already? The investigation officially began the next morning, but the doubt had already begun growing quietly overnight, because when something terrible happens without noise, without witnesses, without chaos, investigators stop asking who and start asking how. And in this case, the how refused to behave like a roadside crime because every normal explanation collapsed under simple logic. And Richard Lewis was sitting alone in a hospital corridor when Detective Aaron Whitmore first approached him, a man in his early 50s with a slow voice and careful eyes, and he did not accuse Richard of anything. He simply asked him to repeat the events again, from the phone call onward. And Richard did, repeating it word for word, because there was nothing to hide, and because, in his mind, repeating it would somehow bring clarity. But clarity did not come. Instead, every repetition made the timeline tighter and tighter until it left no breathing room for coincidence. And when Whitmore asked Richard exactly where Daniel was sitting in the car, Richard said passenger seat, leaned slightly forward, and when asked where he himself was, Richard said driving, both hands on the wheel. And when asked whether there was any argument, Richard shook his head and said no, not even a word raised, and that answer was later verified by neighbors, who said Daniel and Richard had not been heard arguing at home in months, and coworkers who said Richard spoke about his son proudly and constantly. And this mattered because motive is the skeleton of any case, and here the skeleton looked empty. And yet, the forensic findings refused to cooperate with innocence in the way people expect innocence to look, because when the autopsy was completed by Dr. Elaine Parker, the report stated that the wound was inflicted by a narrow, sharp object, likely a blade, with a single forward thrust, no hesitation marks, no slashing motion, meaning the person who delivered it knew exactly where to strike and applied controlled force. And that description does not fit a panicked roadside attacker hiding in bushes, because panic leaves patterns, and this did not. And the angle of entry suggested the wound was delivered by someone standing close, at equal height, facing Daniel directly. And that detail immediately eliminated theories of a passing cyclist or a random hit from behind. And when investigators reconstructed the scene using mannequins, they found that the only way the wound could have been inflicted was if Daniel was already outside the car, standing upright and facing someone he recognized enough not to raise his arms defensively. And that recognition detail would later become crucial because people flinch instinctively unless they trust the person in front of them, and Daniel did not flinch. And while police were careful not to accuse anyone publicly, they quietly began examining Daniel's background, and what they found unsettled them, because Daniel Lewis had been involved in a minor altercation 2 months earlier at a roadside bar with a man named Victor Hale, who had suffered a non-fatal stab wound to the thigh. And although Daniel was never charged, witnesses said Daniel had been holding a small folding knife that night, and that detail had never been shared with Richard, because Daniel had told officers he did not want to worry his father. And Richard had accepted that explanation later when it surfaced, believing his son had made a youthful mistake and moved on. And when police searched Daniel's belongings, they found no knife on him, but that absence mattered as much as presence, because if a knife existed and was not found, it meant it was either removed from the scene or hidden elsewhere. And yet Richard had not left Daniel's side from collapse to ambulance arrival and had no opportunity to dispose of anything. And that is where the case began to twist, because logic demanded a missing object, but reality offered no person who could have removed it. And while public sympathy poured toward Richard, investigators privately started mapping a different picture, one where trust itself had created the opportunity. Because Richard did not watch Daniel closely when he stepped out of the car, he did not follow immediately, he did not ask questions, he assumed sickness, not danger. And that assumption gave Daniel a brief window of privacy measured not in minutes but in seconds, and seconds were all that were required. And the most shocking evidence emerged not from blood or blades, but from digital data, because when Daniel's phone was analyzed more deeply, analysts found a deleted note created earlier that evening, not a suicide note, not a confession, but a reminder reading "Tell Dad, bike broke, service road." And that line froze the room because it showed planning, not panic. It showed foresight. It showed a deliberate setup designed to bring Richard to a specific location at a specific time. And when this was paired with the earlier altercation and the missing knife, investigators began to suspect something horrifying, that Daniel was in trouble, possibly legal, possibly psychological, and had planned to use his father's presence not to harm him, but to anchor himself to someone he trusted in a moment of crisis. But moments like that are unpredictable, and when you add a blade and darkness and fear, unpredictability turns fatal. And the final blow to the random attack theory came from toxicology, showing no alcohol, no drugs, no impairing substances in Daniel's system, meaning his actions were conscious, deliberate, and not fueled by intoxication. And that clarity stripped away excuses, leaving only intention and trust. And when prosecutors later reviewed the case, they chose not to charge Richard because evidence did not support homicide by another person, but the case was also not labeled accidental because accidents do not involve planning, notes, and missing knives and deliberate positioning. And instead, it was classified quietly as a complex death with contributing behavioral factors, a label that satisfies paperwork but satisfies no human being. And Richard Lewis was left with a question that would haunt him far more than any accusation. Why did he trust his son that night, without hesitation, without a pause, without the instinct to protect himself? And the answer was as simple as it was devastating, because he was a father, and because love teaches us to lower our guard, not raise it. And the evidence did not show betrayal in the way people expect. It showed something worse, a moment where trust and desperation met at the roadside, and neither survived. And the full weight of that truth would only become heavier as more details emerged. The weeks after the case classification were harder than the night itself, because shock eventually dulls, but questions sharpen. And Richard Lewis returned to work, moved back into routine, smiled when spoken to, nodded when required, but inside, his mind replayed the roadside moment on a loop. Every detail, every sound, every breath. Because when authorities say there is no one to blame, they unintentionally give the grief nowhere to land. And Richard began attending mandatory counseling arranged through his employer, where a licensed therapist named Carol Monroe gently asked him to describe his relationship with Daniel. And those sessions slowly uncovered pieces that investigators had not prioritized because they were not dramatic enough for reports, but they mattered for understanding how trust can quietly become vulnerability. Richard spoke about how Daniel had changed over the past year, becoming quieter, more private, always checking his phone, stepping outside to take calls, and brushing off concern by saying it was just work stress. And Richard believed him because believing was easier than pushing, and because after Elaine's death, he had promised himself he would never suffocate his son with suspicion. And this pattern repeated itself in small ways. Daniel borrowed money once and said he would pay it back next month. Richard did not ask why he needed it. Daniel came home late with unexplained scratches. Richard assumed clumsiness. Daniel once asked oddly specific questions about life insurance payouts and death benefits, phrased casually like trivia, and Richard laughed it off as curiosity, because when trust has been built brick by brick, you do not dismantle it over odd comments. And this context became critical when financial investigators later discovered that Daniel had been contacted repeatedly by a private loan recovery agency in the weeks before his death, and those calls had been ignored or silenced, and the amount owed was not small. It was enough to frighten someone, enough to corner them into thinking irrationally. And yet none of those collectors ever contacted Richard because Daniel had listed himself as the sole contact, and that choice showed intention to shield his father from stress. And when prosecutors reviewed this information, they began to see the outline of a psychological trap. Daniel was caught in pressure closing from multiple sides. Debt unresolved, legal fear from the earlier bar incident, shame about disappointing the only person he loved, and the belief that one dramatic moment might reset everything. And the roadside was chosen not randomly, but because it was quiet, controlled, isolated, and familiar. Daniel had grown up passing that road on school trips. He knew the timing of traffic. He knew where the street light flickered and where shadows fell. And he knew his father would come without hesitation. And that knowledge was not used maliciously, but strategically, because Daniel did not trust strangers. He trusted only one person enough to be present at what he believed would be a controlled act. And that belief was wrong and fatal, because controlled harm is a myth when emotions override logic. And the most chilling confirmation of this theory came from a small detail found much later, when Richard cleaned Daniel's apartment months after the funeral. Tucked inside a drawer was the missing folding knife, wrapped in a cloth stained faintly dark brown. And when Richard held it, his hands shook so violently he dropped it and collapsed onto the floor, because that object erased the last illusion of randomness. And when police examined it, they confirmed the blade dimensions matched the wound exactly, and there were no other fingerprints on it besides Daniel's. And that single fact ended all remaining debate, because it proved Daniel was alone with the weapon, and that Richard never touched it, never knew it existed, and could never have anticipated what was about to happen. And the knife was not planted, it was hidden deliberately after use, which meant Daniel had the presence of mind to conceal it even as his body was failing. And that detail shattered the idea of accident entirely, because accidents do not hide evidence. And when this finding was quietly added to the case file, it reframed the night not as violence inflicted, but as a moment of catastrophic misjudgment, fueled by pressure and trust. And the most disturbing realization came from reconstructing Daniel's likely intention based on behavioral cues. Doctors theorized that Daniel may not have intended to die, but intended to injure himself just enough to appear attacked, forcing medical intervention, gaining sympathy, perhaps delaying consequences, and critically, having his father as a witness to innocence. But the human body does not negotiate with intentions, and when the blade struck deeper than planned, severing a vessel, there was no time for reversal, no time to explain, no time to confess, and Richard's presence turned from anchor to witness in seconds, and that is what haunted him most. Not that he trusted his son, but that his trust was used unintentionally as part of a plan that unraveled beyond control. And people often ask why Richard did not notice signs, why he did not question more, why he did not protect himself. But those questions misunderstand how trust works in families. Trust is not a switch flipped on demand. It is a default setting built over years of reliability and love. And Daniel had never betrayed that trust before, not once. And when you raise a child alone after loss, you cling to connection, not suspicion, because suspicion feels like another loss. And that is why Richard trusted his son that night, because every previous night that trust had been rewarded with safety, with honesty, with homecomings. And when the truth finally settled, public opinion softened, but personal guilt did not. Richard blamed himself for answering the call, for stopping the car, for not stepping out faster, for not asking what was wrong, for not seeing the knife, for not sensing fear where he saw discomfort. And counselors told him this was survivor's guilt layered with parental grief, but labels do not silence memory, and the roadside still exists, unchanged. Cars still pass, the light still flickers, and people still pull over there, unaware that one quiet decision made with love turned into a lifelong burden for a man who did nothing wrong and yet carries everything. And if there is a lesson in this case, it is not about mistrust or fear. It is about understanding that pressure can twist good intentions into irreversible actions, and that the people we trust most are often the ones we never imagine capable of hurting themselves in ways that hurt us forever. And if this story made you pause, think, or see trust differently, then take a moment now. Subscribe to this channel for more real human stories where truth is stranger and heavier than fiction. And leave a comment below with your thoughts, because conversations like these matter, and your voice keeps these stories alive. After the knife was found and logged into evidence, the case moved into a phase that was never meant for public discussion because there was no crime to prosecute and no one to accuse. Yet, the consequences continued unfolding quietly through records, meetings, and medical reviews. And Richard Lewis was called in again, not as a suspect, not a witness, but as the legal next of kin required to hear the final findings. And those meetings are different from interrogations. There is no tension, no raised voices, only careful language chosen to reduce harm. And yet every sentence still cuts. And Detective Whitmore explained slowly that the official conclusion would remain complex death with behavioral factors contributing. And Richard nodded because by then words had lost sharpness. And when asked if he had any questions, he asked only one: "Was my son afraid?" And that question stopped the room because fear is not measurable in reports. And Dr. Parker answered honestly, saying based on injury mechanics and lack of hesitation marks, Daniel likely acted with determination, not panic. And that answer hurt more than fear would have, because determination means time to think, time to reconsider, and time to stop. And yet he didn't. And Richard went home carrying a file that contained diagrams, photographs, and explanations no father should ever have to possess. And he locked it in a drawer unopened, because understanding is not the same as healing. And as months passed, the subtle consequences of that night began surfacing in ways no one warned him about. He became hyper-aware of roadside stops, flinching when cars slowed near shoulders, unable to drive at night without gripping the wheel too tightly. And those reactions mattered because they showed that even when blame is removed, trauma finds other places to live. And one of the hardest moments came when Richard finally listened to the voicemail Daniel had left earlier that evening, before the call, the one investigators recovered later and had avoided playing out of respect. And the message was short, casual, almost cheerful, saying, "Dad, if I don't pick up later, don't worry. Phone battery's acting weird. I'll see you tomorrow." And that line destroyed the last illusion of finality because it proved Daniel had imagined a tomorrow. And that single word contradicted any theory of intentional death, reinforcing the idea that this was not suicide but miscalculation. And that distinction is important because it reframes the story from despair to error, from intention to tragedy. And as forensic psychologists reviewed the case, they emphasized something rarely discussed publicly: that young adults under acute stress often engage in symbolic acts, believing they can control outcomes. And Daniel's act appears to fit that pattern: a belief that pain could pause reality, force intervention, and delay consequences, without fully grasping how thin the margin between injury and death truly is. And this understanding did not comfort Richard, but it answered one question that haunted him: why his son would involve him at all. And the answer was simple: Daniel trusted him to be there, not to save him from death, but to save him from consequences. And that trust was misplaced, not because Richard failed, but because no one can rescue someone from every outcome. And the most unsettling realization came when reviewing phone metadata showing Daniel had searched medical information earlier that week. Phrases like non-fatal stab location, survive bleeding, and safe injury spots. And those searches proved planning, but also misunderstanding, because the human body does not have safe places for blades. And this evidence was not shared publicly to avoid sensationalism, but it existed and it mattered. And when Richard learned about it, he felt a complicated mix of sorrow and anger, not at his son, but at the illusion of control that the internet had sold him. And this case quietly became a reference point in forensic education circles, not for crime, but for misjudgment, used to teach that intention does not determine outcome and that trust can unintentionally facilitate harm. And Richard allowed that use reluctantly, because if his son's death could prevent another, then some meaning could exist. And yet at home, the silence remained heavier than any report, and the roadside remained a fixed point in his memory, a place where trust intersected with pressure and produced irreversible consequence. And people often ask what warning signs were missed, and the answer is uncomfortable because the signs were not dramatic. There were no threats, no breakdowns, no farewells, only small deflections, small secrecy, small stress responses that could describe millions of people. And that is why this case matters, because it shows how easily normal can mask danger, and how trust built a lifetime can become the final variable in a chain of events no one intended. And Richard Lewis continues to live with that knowledge, not as punishment, but as reality. And the night remains unchanged in his mind: a phone call, a roadside stop, a decision made in love, and the moment that followed it forever. Time did what it always does after a death like this. It kept moving without permission and forced Richard Lewis to move with it, even when every instinct told him to stay frozen at the roadside. In the fifth phase of this story is not about evidence or reports, but about consequences that unfold quietly, long after headlines disappear. Because when a death has no villain, society does not know where to place its anger, and it often lands on the person who survived. And Richard felt that shift when whispers began circulating at work and in his neighborhood. People did not accuse him directly, but they asked careful questions, the kind that sound innocent but carry suspicion, like, why did he stop there? Or why didn't he call an ambulance sooner? And those questions mattered because they show how easily trust can be reframed as negligence once outcomes are known. And Richard withdrew not out of guilt but exhaustion, because defending love is harder than defending logic. And one of the most painful moments came during a routine insurance review, when a clerk asked him to clarify beneficiary details and mentioned that Daniel had recently updated his own policy, naming Richard as sole beneficiary. And that fact reopened wounds because it suggested foresight but not motive. Insurance payouts were modest, not life-changing, and could not explain the level of planning involved, but it reinforced the idea that Daniel was arranging pieces, believing he would remain alive to manage them. And Richard requested the policy be canceled immediately, donating the proceeds later, because money felt wrong attached to that night. And mental health professionals later explained that this response is common. Survivors reject anything that feels like gain from loss. And Richard's behavior followed that pattern: withdrawing, giving away belongings, avoiding spaces associated with the event. And the roadside became a psychological boundary he refused to cross, until one day he was forced to, because roadwork rerouted traffic directly through that service road, and when he drove past it in daylight, he was struck by how ordinary it looked. No darkness, no menace, just asphalt, weeds, and a flickering light. And that ordinariness disturbed him more than night ever had, because it confirmed there was nothing special about the place, that danger had not waited there, it had been carried there. And that understanding slowly shifted Richard's internal narrative, from self-blame to acceptance, not forgiveness, acceptance that trust was not a mistake, it was a constant, and the outcome was not proof of error but of unpredictability. And this shift was fragile, interrupted by dreams where Daniel stood by the car asking for help again. And Richard woke sweating, heart racing, because the brain does not understand closure the way courts do. And during one counseling session, Richard finally said something that reframed the entire case. He said, "If I hadn't trusted him that night, I wouldn't be his father anymore." And that sentence stopped the therapist, because it captured the impossible choice parents face: trust and risk, or doubt and distance. And in that context, the question, why did Mr. Lewis trust his son that night, becomes less an accusation and more an acknowledgement that he acted exactly as a father should have, based on every piece of information he had at the time. And that realization matters, because society often judges decisions using outcomes rather than context, and this case demonstrates the danger of that bias. And as forensic educators continued referencing the case, they emphasized that trust is not negligence when it is built on consistent behavior, and that Daniel's actions were an anomaly, not a pattern. And this distinction protected Richard legally, but emotionally he still carried the weight. And when asked years later in a support group what he would do differently if given the chance, Richard paused and said, "I would still go. I would still stop the car. I would still trust him, because the alternative is losing your child while they're alive." And that answer silenced the room, because it reframed survival as something heavier than death. And that is where the evidence finally stops being about knives and timelines and becomes about human cost, and the reality that sometimes there is no lesson that prevents tragedy, only understanding that reduces cruelty toward those left behind. And Richard Lewis lives with that understanding now, not healed, not broken, but altered, carrying the truth that trust did not cause the night, but defined who he was when it happened. And that is something no evidence can undo. The final stage of this story does not arrive with resolution, because real life rarely offers clean endings, and instead it settles into something quieter, something that looks ordinary from the outside and heavy from within. And Richard Lewis learned this when the official file was closed and the last envelope arrived in the mail stamped, "Final review, no further action." And that phrase should have meant relief, but instead it marked the moment when no authority, no expert, no report would ever add anything new. And from that day forward, the responsibility of meaning belonged only to him. And Richard returned to the roadside one last time, not at night, but in late afternoon when traffic was steady and the light did not flicker. And he stood there, watching cars pass, realizing how invisible pain can be to people moving through their own lives. And not invisibility is what makes stories like this repeat, because nothing about Daniel's life looked like an emergency from the outside, and nothing about that night looked dangerous until it was already irreversible. And Richard placed no memorial, no flowers, no marker, because he did not want the place to become a symbol. He wanted it to remain what it was, an ordinary stretch of road where something extraordinary and unintended occurred. And in that moment, he understood that the question, why did Mr. Lewis trust his son that night, would follow him forever, but not as blame and not as doubt, but as a reminder of how love operates without contracts, without safeguards, and without guarantees. And that understanding reshaped how he spoke to people afterward, especially parents who came to him quietly after hearing his story, saying they were worried about their own children. And Richard never offered advice, because advice implies certainty, and certainty had betrayed him. Instead, he offered presence, he listened, he asked questions, he stayed engaged, because the one thing he learned is that silence creates space for miscalculation, and connection, even imperfect connection, can interrupt it. And when asked by a community group to speak about the case, he agreed once and spoke plainly, avoiding drama, saying trust did not fail him, ignorance did. And ignorance is not a crime, it is a condition of being human. And he reminded them that most people who make catastrophic mistakes do not intend catastrophe, they intend delay, relief, or control. And the body does not care about intention, and the road does not either. And the truth is uncomfortable because it offers no villain, no moral superiority, only vulnerability and responsibility shared across systems, families, education, and mental health awareness. And as years passed, Richard stopped reliving the moment frame by frame and began remembering Daniel as he lived, not as he died. And that shift marked survival, not closure. And the case faded from records but not from impact, because it continues to be cited quietly in training rooms as an example of how trust and pressure intersect, and why outcomes cannot be predicted by intention alone. And if there is one final truth in this story, it is that Richard Lewis did not trust his son because he was naive. He trusted him because love trained him to. And that trust was consistent, rational, and earned over a lifetime. And the tragedy lies not in the trust, but in the silence that surrounded the pressure Daniel was under. And if this story made you pause, if it made you reflect on how easily ordinary nights can carry extraordinary weight, then take a moment now, subscribe to this channel for more real-life stories that reveal the hidden layers behind human decisions, and leave a comment below sharing your perspective because every shared perspective helps others see what silence often hides.